Got a minute, folks? Let's play through Minit in a series of shorts, and for each new life, I'll share a little tale from my own until we reach the finish line. I'm sure we won't set any speedrun records, but it should be a good time all the same. Super Smash Bros. Came out when I was still super small, but if my upload history is any indication, saying the series left an impression would be an understatement. Like anything that dates back to your single digits, I only recall snippets about the original game in its heyday. The earliest, I think, was learning it existed while chatting with my sister in our backyard, and while characters like Mario, Pikachu, Donkey Kong, and Kirby got my attention for being familiar folks, I distinctly remember finding it funny that there was a Fox character simply named Fox. Sometime later, Glenn visited the village and brought a copy of the game, so Will and I joined him for many a battle, and it became our primary activity whenever he'd come to town. I still remember us routinely trying to unlock Captain Falcon whenever the data was cleared, going to Saffron City to see the cycling Pokémon, and just goofing around on the Mushroom Kingdom stage with Ness, Yoshi, and Jigglypuff. Every entry improved on the formula, but my fondness for that first game hasn't faded. I dare say it was a smashing start to the series. I can attest to Pokémon being pretty big on the playground back in the 90s. Pretty sure I started playing around the time I was still learning to read, and all the truncated terms definitely added to the comprehension challenge. The second generation is when I remember seeing more of the games at school though, and fortunately for me, Pokémon Silver also worked on Game Boy Pocket, so I was able to participate in the fun. One of my childhood chums had a link cable in Forbidden Knowledge too, so I got my hands on a handful of level 100 Blastoise that found their way in both Silver and Red, and a Celebi named Celery. I never really battled other people and mostly focused on collecting my favorites and battling the Elite Four. It's a shame that Silver and Gold cartridges lost their save files, because I'd love to take a look at my team again and be able to see just how many Hall of Fame entries I logged. It might be better not to know. Sometime during the 5th console generation, my family got a PlayStation, and when we picked up the system, my sister and I were allowed to claim one game each for it. She chose Metal Gear Solid, and I nabbed Crash Bandicoot 2, Cortex Strikes Back. I couldn't tell you why the second game was my pick over the first. I'd like to give myself the benefit of the doubt and say the first game probably wasn't there for me to consider, but I guess I wasn't too concerned with continuity and just saw box art that caught my attention. Whatever the case, I eventually claimed the whole trilogy, and the second game still stands as my favorite entry, so I picked well. At the time, I was restricted to 1 hour of gaming a day and didn't have a memory card, so I became super familiar with the first Warp Room. Eventually, I'd do well enough to tackle the second and get a glimpse of the third before time was up, but actually beating the game would have to wait till I got my hands on a memory card. While I didn't have a system from the 4th console generation, Will had a SNES that satisfied our TV-based Nintendo cravings. Super Mario World definitely saw a lot of mileage back in those days, but I think the highlight for us was whenever his cousin came to town with Donkey Kong Country 2. That game was the definitive platforming experience in the 90s, and every time we get our hands on it, we'd dive in for another playthrough. It's the same deal with the N64 too. Will had the original Banjo-Kazooie at home, but if we wanted to play Banjo-Tooie, we'd have to wait for Will's cousin to bring it over for our next opportunity. It's funny how the games we enjoyed the most always seem to be the ones we didn't own ourselves. We would eventually though. Not only did Will have a Super Nintendo, but he also had more Sega Genesis consoles than one household could ever need, and we certainly put them through their paces. Golden Axe, Bubble and Squeak, Earthworm Jim, Altered Beast, and Jewel Master are a few names that come to mind, but the cream of the crop were definitely Mortal Kombat and Sonic the Hedgehog. We were technically way too young to be playing Mortal Kombat in our formative years, but there's a world of difference between mature titles in the 90s and what's developed today. I know we wouldn't have been allowed to play something as graphic as Mortal Kombat 11, but the original MK trilogy was far from nightmare fuel with how basic the violence was. As for Sonic, the appeal there is pretty obvious. Platformers with simultaneous co-op was a perfect recipe for a good time, and those games offered a spin on the formula that made them feel unique compared to their contemporaries. And you know, even today, I still find the idea of combining 2 cartridges to create Sonic 3 and Knuckles to be a nifty and novel concept. My first game console was actually a Nintendo Entertainment System, but I couldn't tell you when my family picked it up. I just remember having Super Mario Bros. And Duck Hunt as far back as my memory goes. The system stopped working and was thrown out well before I had my games preservation mindset though. My Game Boy Pocket also seems to predate any concrete memories, but while I never held onto the boxes of Donkey Kong Land and Super Mario Land, I started keeping them intact by the time Pokémon Red and Yellow came around. I think I can thank my fascination with manuals for kickstarting that collection. Those booklets provided extra trivia and illustrations I enjoyed, and the boxes were an extension of that. It always seemed strange to me that they'd put effort into including information at the back of cases, since they could never be seen from behind on store shelves. But my interest in seeing how games were marketed came from those too. I really wish I held on to those NES boxes. Ah well, humble beginnings. The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask was out for quite a while before I was able to experience it for myself. My first exposure to it was hearing tales from Will after he had a couple opportunities to dabble with it, but my first time playing it came after borrowing it from a cousin as part of a collector's edition disc on the GameCube. It not only lived up to expectations, but surpassed them. Experiencing the game that way was bittersweet though. I was definitely the type to preserve my media well by that point, keeping my cases and discs in impeccable shape. But when that disc would return home between borrows, it accumulated a lot of scratches from the other side. I remember being pretty disheartened, thinking it'd probably be unreadable before I get my hands on it again, but in time I got my own copy of the collector's edition. I also got it digitally on the Wii later on, and the 3DS remake beyond that, so my Majora's Mask needs have been more than met since those days. And I couldn't be happier, let me tell you. Metroid Prime is a game I've experienced more times than I can count now, but I think I watched through more playthroughs than I tackled myself. When Will and I would hang out with a hankering for single-player adventures, one of us would be in the driver's seat and the other would watch if they didn't have handheld business on the itinerary. Metroid Prime was one of those games that came up a lot. When a new Prime game would release, or it's just been a while, a revisit was sure to come. That was even true for the Nintendo Switch remake, too. Those spectator sessions definitely made the debut and rise of platforms like Twitch make a lot of sense. I immediately understood the allure of watching someone else play a game, but the difference between watching your best friend play a game and having conversations in the same room versus watching a stranger through a screen took time to appreciate. I still prefer watching a chum over a streamer, but these days there's lots of overlap between the two, which is pretty delightful if I do say so myself. I've had my share of data disasters in my time, but my first experience with that came courtesy of my Wii U back when I was transferring my Wii software and files over. Something went wrong during the process and all my save data was purged. My Pokémon Ranch and its collection of 4th gen Pokémon were wiped, and my esteemed trophy collection in Brawl was lost to time. Fortunately, the history of my purchases on the Wii Shop channel remained intact, so at least I was able to download everything again. That whole ordeal definitely changed my relationship with data though. I still love completing games, but I try not to get too attached to the contents of those files. I say try because now I always feel the need to record everything for both content creation and simple preservation in cases where the data feels irreplaceable, like Animal Crossing villages. My cityfolk town might be gone, but my New Horizons will forever endure. It's healthy, right? I have quite a bit of sentimentality for all the consoles and handhelds I've had over the years, but I think my Nintendo DS is particularly special. I wanted one for a while before I finally scooped one up, but my grandpa had just passed away after an enduring battle with dementia, so the system in my copy of Super Mario 64 DS was something of an inheritance. If you never lost a loved one to that disease before, suffice it to say it leaves an impact. But I think my parents had the right idea letting me have something with staying power to soften the blow. I remember tearing up on the ride home while I was unboxing the system and heading into Peach's castle to kick off my first playthrough, but juxtaposed with riding down that same road with Will years later, breaking out our new copies of Pokémon Diamond and Pearl to start our inaugural Sinnoh adventure and gleefully battling Starlies, and it definitely grew into an unconventional memento that's brought me a lot of joy. Can't be disappointed there. After high school graduation and the devastating discovery that the college I was enrolling into was a sketchy scam, I took a break from academia to lock in a game plan and decompress from a hearty hustle. I did a lot of writing during those months, experimenting with graphic novel outlines and creative writing exercises, but it was also the window where I first played Kid Icarus Uprising. As an aspiring game writer, that title really delivered a format that inspired, and when I think back to that gap year, my experience playing through its story stands as a highlight. I wouldn't know it at the time, but delaying my post-secondary debut proved to be immensely worthwhile. Maybe a tale for another day. We'll see. Demo discs were an absolute blessing back in the 90s. I'm pretty confident I had a memory card by the time the first of those discs cropped up in my life, but it was still nice to have titles to try that wouldn't take up precious kilobytes. I got to try games like Spyro the Dragon and Crash 3 in advance thanks to those discs, but it's the games I never would have discovered otherwise that I especially valued. Threads of Fate is one of those games, which was an action RPG where one of its two protagonists could transform into different enemies. Brave Fencer Musashi and Wild 9 were standouts too, but my number one was Medieval. The music and atmosphere of that game was something else, and while it took ages to finally claim a copy of my own, I was able to get its sequel and sunk dozens of hours into it. Without those demo discs, it's hard to say if I ever would have dove into the series. And let me tell you folks, that would have been pretty tragic. Game boxes, manuals, and Pokédex entries were where I cut my teeth, but I think the trophies in Super Smash Bros. Melee is where I really took the deep dive into trivia and lore. I loved looking at the models and learning about the characters and their games of origin. Smash Bros. In general was a treasure trove of information on other titles, and being able to dig into everything and make little discoveries was an absolute delight. Melee was around the time I started having access to the internet too, so looking up games and their trivia quickly expanded from there. I also appreciated how the Picklepedia of Pikmin 2 took the descriptive text of trophies and gave it more characterization by having the cast deliver the info. Anyway, exploring lore like that is a deeply ingrained passion of mine, and as you might imagine, my channel is kind of an extension of that fascination. It's all trivia and time. A perfect combination if you ask me. Space Station Silicon Valley is one of my favorite obscure games. Today, I can sum it up pretty easily as an N64 take on Super Mario Odyssey, where instead of tossing a cap on enemies, you'd hijack synthetic animals as a robot turned microchip. Unlike with Mario though, your base form isn't mechanically diverse. You can jump and wander around, but doing so slowly drains your health, so you're incentivized to always be defeating and overtaking critters to navigate. Factoring in threats of fate, it seems like I'm a big fan of games where you take on the form of your enemies. Even the copy abilities in Kirby align with that theme, so this has been a journey of self-discovery here, but I digress. Space Station Silicon Valley is definitely a game you should look up sometime, because it's a really charming platformer with a pretty delightful, diegetic soundtrack with plenty of platforming puzzles to unravel. I'd love to see it have some presence on the channel down the road, but all my N64 converters have failed so far. At this point, the console might be the problem. Anyway, in the meantime, I'll keep digging into that. I used to set up a little tabletop tree in my room every holiday season just for decoration, and something I'll never forget is waking up one Christmas morning and noticing my parents managed to sneak in while I was asleep and slipped a present under it. It was a copy of Donkey Kong Country 3, and let me tell you, I was eager to finally try that game. Ever since DKC came to the GBA, I predicted it was finally the generation where all 3 entries would get ports. Suffice it to say, I was one chipper chap. What a morning. Mainline Mario games never disappoint, but I think the entry that had the most impact for me was Super Mario Galaxy. I think its somber, solitary atmosphere paired with more compact level design is what really captivated me. Years and sequels later, I remember being delighted to discover Rosalina made a comeback in Super Mario 3D World as a playable character, complete with the spin mechanic from Galaxy in her moveset. That association between my experience with Galaxy and Rosalina debuting in that game granted me an appreciation for the character as something of a symbol, and I'd play as her in a lot of titles to follow. I feel similarly with Darius in Mortal Kombat 1, where the character's association with deception gives me a greater fondness for him than I would have otherwise had. I'm kinda wondering how common that might be, because I'm pretty confident I'm far from the only fellow who picks some of their favorites like that. Let me know in the comments if you don't mind. Valuable insights there. I didn't get my hands on my own Nintendo 64 until way beyond the system's heyday. At the time, my library of titles was small, but that number jumped up quite a bit when the video network in a nearby town was clearing out its library. From Super Mario 64 and Mario Kart 64, I added games like Pokémon Stadium, Yoshi's Story, and a copy of Super Smash Bros. To my collection. I have that store to thank for Kirby 64, Dr. Mario 64, and more too. It's a shame the store is gone, but I've got those boxes now. I know a lot of folks like diving into a new game, beating it, and never looking back. I'm definitely not part of that camp. I always love revisiting old titles, but as life marches forward, it seems there's never enough time. I just get to take glances at the shelf, knowing some of those titles might not see another playthrough in my lifetime. A little grim. I bought myself a black Wii Remote back in the Wii's twilight years, but I didn't want its glossy sheen to be ruined by hand smudges, so I never used it. Fast forward to when I was finally ready to swing up a storm, and I discovered its batteries corroded and ruined it. Learned a valuable lesson that day. Enjoy things while you have them. Whenever a new game is on the horizon, its release date tends to get drilled into my memory, but eventually it fades and I'll just recall a rough window or year. In the case of the first Pokémon Mystery Dungeon though, September 18th has been burned in deep. Do you have any games like that? Consider me curious. One of my favorite feelings in the world is the hollowness that accompanies reaching the end of an impactful experience. Off the cuff, games like Final Fantasy XV, Metal Gear Solid 4, and Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Darkness come to mind, but every medium has its own highlights. Turn back the clock, and a desire to share that sensation with others was what drove me to enroll in back-to-back game development and scriptwriting programs. I wanted to learn how to work in my favorite medium and then further hone my writing before diving into the industry to try my hand at telling stories that leave people with that empty feeling. It's sobering to think after all these years I still haven't really accomplished that in any format or fashion yet. Well, time might be up today, but you could say tomorrow's another year. Anyway, thanks for joining me on this short journey.